Hello and Assalamu alaikum. In this video, we'll be solving the O Levels Biology 5090 May June 2022 Paper 2 Variant 2 paper. So before we begin, I would like to tell you the important information regarding this paper. Firstly, you have 1 hour and 45 minutes to attempt this paper and the total marks are 80. You should also remember that from 2023 onwards, there were no sections and you had to attempt all the questions. So, before we begin with the paper, I would like to tell you about a very convenient way to study for any O level subject, which is our topical past papers. So let's say you're solving the topical questions and you're stuck on a topic called homeostasis and you do not know how to solve that question. So if you have our topical past papers, you will see right beside the heading there will be a QR code. और जब आप उसको scan करेंगे, you will be leaded to a playlist on YouTube. वहाँ पे हम simultaneously solve कर होते with our topical past papers the questions. So this is a very good way to enhance your concepts. So having said that, let's move on to the questions. Question number one. The diagram shows the human brain and the table lists the functions of some parts of the human brain. So you've been given the diagram of the human brain and then you have the functions according to the parts. So part A, label on the diagram the parts of the brain identified in the table using label lines in the letters A to D only. So by A to D, you have to label the parts of the brain by seeing their function. So, part A, memory storage and control of conscious behavior. That is done by the cerebrum and it is the largest part of your brain, this whole thing. So, we would label it as A. Part B, control of body temperature. That is done by hypothalamus. So, that is present here, this thing. Part C, control of balance and coordination. That is done by the cerebellum, which is this part. If you see this picture that I have attached, it is very similar to that given in your exam. And it has all those four parts labeled which we are talking about. So, the part D, control of unconscious activities such as breathing, that is done by the medulla, which is this part. Now, part B, name one structure in the skin that receives impulses from part B of the brain to control body temperature. So, which structure in the skin receives impulses from the hypothalamus of the brain? So, it could be sweat glands, it could be hair erector muscles, it could be arterioles, anything. But note that capillaries could not have been the answer, and that is rejected in the mark scheme. Why? Because they indirectly, so this is very important, they indirectly help by controlling the blood flow to the skin and help in heat exchange. They do not directly receive impulses from the hypothalamus. This is a very important thing, and you should know that. Unlike sweat glands or hair erector muscles, they do not directly get the impulses from the hypothalamus. That's why they could not be mentioned here. In part 2, you had to outline how the action of the structure results in the control of body temperature. So, what happens is that sweat glands, as known by the name, they release sweat, right? So, you could get one mark here. Then you had to explain that when the sweat glands releases sweat, it comes on the surface of the skin. So when you're in a hot environment, you obviously produce more sweat and your body needs to cool down in order to regulate body temperature. So what happens is that you produce sweat and it comes on the skin surface and then it evaporates from there. And when it is evaporated, it leaves a cooling effect to the body. So what the second mark would have been for evaporation and third mark for the cooling. So that's how you secured 3 marks for this part. Question number 2. The diagram shows apparatus used to study breathing. Part A, describe what will happen to the upper box containing air as a person takes one breath in from the apparatus. Taking in breath means inhaling, so we need to tell what happens to the upper box. So it is a very common sense question that obviously the box will fall down as we breathe in from this mouthpiece. Part 2, state the percentage of oxygen in the atmospheric air. So you can write anything from 20 to 21%. That is the range. Explain how the percentage of oxygen in the air in the upper box will change as a person breathes in and out through the apparatus several times. So, if the person inhales and exhales several times, what is going to happen to the percentage of oxygen present in the upper box? So, it is obviously going to decrease because when we inhale the oxygen from the air, the oxygen percentage will decrease in the surrounding air, and it's going to go through the alveoli into our blood. It's going to diffuse into our blood where aerobic respiration occurs, and that is only done in the presence of O2, right? That's why we need oxygen, and while we breathe in, the oxygen level for the surrounding air is going to decrease. Part 3, substance M is present in the apparatus to absorb an excretory product from expired air. So, expired air is which comes out of our mouth or nose. Name this excretory product. So, it can be CO2 because it also has substance M is also present to absorb that product. It can be anything like lime water or anything. But since that is not demanded in the question, we would just write CO2. So, part B, the diagram shows a bar chart recorded by the pen on the revolving drum. So, you saw in the diagram that here was the revolving drum and the pen. The, this chart was recorded for a period of 1 minute by a person at rest. So, 60 seconds are equal to 1 minute, and it was recorded for that period of time by a person at rest. Means he was not performing any activity. He was just normally breathing. He did not do any exercise, nothing. So he was just normally breathing. So on the y axis, you have the volume of air, and on the x axis, you have time. In part 1, explain how the action of one named muscle caused the part of the chart labeled N. So this is labeled as N, and we have to identify which muscle had caused that to appear. So, if we look in part 1, we said when we inhale, the upper box containing air will fall down. That means we were talking about inhalation all the time. So, if we take that in reference, we know that when we inhale, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles contract. Next point was the diaphragm either goes down or we can say it flattens, and the ribs move upwards and outwards. Next was increase in volume of the thorax or the lungs, and there is decrease in pressure. So always remember, when the volume increases, pressure would decrease, and if the pressure increases, volume would decrease. So there is an inverse relationship between these two. Then obviously you would write about inhaling the air, breathe inside into the lungs, and last was upper box fall and pen moves down. Second part, a second chart was recorded for a period of 1 minute by the same person after vigorous exercise. So the previous chart, the first chart was for a person who was resting, and now it is again recorded for a person who has done a vigorous exercise. So, state how an increased rate of breathing after exercise would be shown on this second chart. So, they have already told you that there will be an increased rate of breathing. That is because during periods of exercise, there is demand of more oxygen, and the body responds by increasing its breathing rate. So, they have already given this piece of information in the question for you. So, all you had to write was there will be a higher frequency of breaths leading to more peaks on the graph, because obviously you need to show in a way that the breathing rate has increased. Question 3. A student carried out two investigations into the action of yeast. Part A. In the first investigation, the student dissolved 20 grams of glucose in 100 centimeter cube of water in a beaker. The student then added 3.5 grams of yeast and used a balance to measure the loss in mass from the beaker over the next 24 hours. So the results of this investigation are shown in this graph. Part 1 says to calculate at which the rate at which mass was lost during the first 6 hours. So if you see the unit of this आंसर यू कैन सी इट्स ग्राम पर आवर तो यहाँ से आपको एक हिंट मिल जाती है कि वी आर गोइंग टू डिवाइड ग्राम्स with hours. So if they told you to check the rate at 6, it would be here. And you can, this is almost the middle, so you can say it's 4.5. So you divide 4.5 with 6. They've given you gram per hour. If it could be gram per minute or seconds, you could have multiplied it with 60 or 600, 3600 accordingly. But since the units are same hours and hours, you do not have to do anything. So this gives you 0.75 as answer. So it means 0.75 gram per hour. Part 2. Explain why mass was lost during the investigation. Now, if you see, you could have written respiration or fermentation, but in both the cases, you would see that carbon dioxide is released out. It escapes from the beaker. So, obviously, the mass will be reduced or lost during the investigation. Because you know that glucose is converted into ethanol and carbon dioxide, and we're talking particularly about fermentation. So, carbon dioxide is released as a gas and it can escape to the surroundings easily. So, this gas loss might have given the appearance of decrease in the mass because it is no more in the container where this fermentation had occurred. Now, they said part 3. The student then repeated this first investigation, changing only the mass of yeast. That means other factors were constant, whatever they were, and only the mass of yeast was changed. So, draw a line on the graph on page 6 to show the pattern of results you would expect the student to obtain when using 7 gram of yeast. So, I remember in the question they said 3.5 grams, which is half of 7 grams. So, if we increase the mass of yeast, that means more carbon dioxide would be lost. So, the graph should be. So, here's how the graph would look like. You have to show it on the left side of the normal graph because there is an increase in the mass loss, there is increased CO2 being lost because there is more yeast at the start. So that means the rate of reaction would be high and more CO2 would be lost. So you have to show that. You cannot draw it on the right side, that would be wrong. That means you cannot show it here. That would be wrong because it would indicate less mass of CO2 being lost and less rate of reaction. Part B. In a second investigation, the student prepared 3 samples of bread dough. Each samples of dough had a volume of 50 centimeter cube and contained 1 gram of yeast, 25 centimeter cube of water, and 40 grams of flour. Part 1. Starch molecules in the flour are used to provide the yeast with a source of glucose. Describe how the action of a named chemical produced by yeast cells make glucose available from starch. So what happens is you need amylase enzyme to digest amylose and you need maltase enzyme to digest maltose. And they would digest the starch molecule making it glucose from the starch. Each sample of dough was placed at the bottom of a 200 centimeter cube measuring cylinder. The 3 measuring cylinders were placed in water baths for different temperatures at 60 minutes. That means for 1 hour you had kept the 3 measuring cylinders for 20, 40, and 80 degrees Celsius. After this time, the student measured the volume of dough in each measuring cylinder. So, how much volume of dough had rised. The diagram shows the volume of dough in the measuring cylinder from the water bath at the temperature of 20 centigrade at the end of the investigation. So this was for 20 and you had to write for 40 and 80. In the next part, you have to estimate the volumes of the dough for 40 and 80 centigrade. So for 40 centigrade, you could have written anything between 80 to 200 because it is an optimum temperature. That means the enzymes were not denatured or they were not working slow. So you could have written anything between 81 and 200. And in 80 degrees, we know that the enzymes can denature, but we also know that yeast cells can make their own glucose. So you could have written anything between 50 to 79. So in part 3, you have to explain the results of this investigation. So we know obviously that carbon dioxide is produced. That's why the dough has rised. So for enzyme at 20, so basically at each temperature, you had to explain all the results. So in 20, there is less kinetic energy, obviously. So there will be fewer collisions and the activity will not be much. 40 can be seen as an optimum temperature. And there will be more kinetic energy than 20 degrees, obviously, and there will be more collisions. In 80, you have to write that they have denatured and active sites have changed their shape. And substrate cannot fit in, so the yeast is also killed. You can write that as well. So you had to mention all the results at different times, different temperatures to get the 3 marks. Question number 4. There are many different types of amino acids. One of these is phenylalanine. The diagram shows the structure of a molecule of phenylalanine. Part A. Phenylalanine is metabolized by an enzyme with the name PAH. Part 1. Name the human organ that metabolizes amino acids such as phenylalanine. So it is liver. Liver is that organ which metabolizes all the amino acids. Part 2. Explain how the shape of a PAH enzyme molecule is important to enable phenylalanine to be metabolized. So we know that enzyme is a protein and enzyme has a specific or a complementary active site to its substrate. So in this case, the PAH enzyme has a complementary active site or a specific active site for only phenylalanine. They fit together to form enzyme substrate complex. So any 3 points out of these could have scored you 3 marks. Part B. A rare gene mutation reduces the activity of the PAH enzyme. The mutation results in an increased concentration of phenylalanine in the blood. This condition can cause damage to the brain. Part 1. Describe what is meant by the term gene mutation. Now, gene mutation means changing the sequence of the gene structure or the nucleotide sequence, the base sequence. So you could write these two and then you would get 2 marks. Part 2. Explain how a person with the condition should change their diet to reduce the risk of damage to the brain. Now, in the above statement, they told you that the rare gene mutation reduces the pH enzyme activity, and this results in increased concentration of phenylalanine in the blood. So, if we take the proteins that have less phenylalanine in them, or we eat foods that are low in protein, we can reduce this the risk of this damage to the brain. Part 3. The gene mutation produces a recessive allele H. A person with a heterozygous genotype is described as a carrier. A carrier will not show symptoms of the condition. Complete the genetic diagram to show the probability of two carriers reproducing to have the offspring with the condition. So they told you that the heterozygous genotype, it is of the parents basically, because they are going to reproduce the offspring. So if you have the heterozygous genotype, you are a carrier. You're not showing the symptoms of that condition. It is only possible when recessive allele is there. You know that H will be the dominant allele and dominant allele के ही features आपको नजर आते हैं through genes. You do not get of the recessive allele. So if we take the gametes, that will be dominant H, the recessive H, and then same because they told you probability of two carriers. So two carriers means this will have the same genotype. Now it will be H, H, then this will be H and small h. This will again be the same genotype, but in this genotype, you can see the recessive allele has come. So they told you you have to complete and check the probability. So if we take the probability of the offspring with the condition, it's going to be 25% because it's just 1 out of 4. 1 in 4 has that. So you can write either of these options, they are acceptable. Question 5. A part. Biological processes in plants are affected by environmental factors. These graphs show each of the effect of changing one environmental factor on a biological process. The labels on the axis for each graph have been replaced with the letters P, Q, R, and S. Identify the correct axis label for each of the P, Q, R, and S. Select from the following possible labels. Now we know that this is the graph for temperature and rate of photosynthesis. This is a very obvious graph and you might have seen multiple times. So on the P on the y axis you have the rate of photosynthesis, and on the Q, which is x axis, you have temperature. Because rate of photosynthesis on y axis, because it is dependent variable, it is dependent on temperature. So you see there is a normal increase in the temperature. So the rate of photosynthesis is also increasing. But you see, this is the peak of the graph. That means must be the temperature could have been, for example, 37 degrees Celsius, and that had been the optimum temperature for the enzymes. But as you increase the temperature, there was a steady decrease that indicated that the rate of photosynthesis has decreased because the enzymes have denatured due to the increased temperature. So in P you would have written rate of photosynthesis and in Q you would write temperature. Now in R and S you have what variables? If you see in R it could have been the rate of transpiration and S could be air humidity. Because if you take light intensity or carbon dioxide concentration, they do not fit this graph well. But if we talk about humidity, what happens is that if you increase humidity, in high humidity, the rate of evaporation or the rate of transpiration is slowed down. Why? Because the air near the leaf surface is already saturated with moisture. That means there are already more water vapors. That's what humid air means. So if there's only humid air present around the leaf, we cannot expect the water to go from inside of the leaf to outside by evaporation. So transpiration will decrease. So R should be the rate of transpiration and S again is air humidity. Part B, describe the process of transpiration in the leaf of a plant. So what happens is that there is evaporation occurring from the surface of the layer of water on the cell walls or as a film of water present in the mesophyll cells. Then the water evaporates, it transforms into water vapor within the intercellular spaces, and then this water vapor moves via diffusion, traveling from areas of high concentration to lower concentration. Down the concentration gradient, this water vapor exits the leaf through the stomata. So you had to write these 3 points, any three key points from this paragraph, and you would have scored 3 marks. So this brings us to the end of the paper. This was only section A because section B and C had been removed from the latest paper onwards from 2023. So there are no more sections. You have to attempt all the questions that you're given in P2. So if you like the video, make sure to share it with your friends and leave down a comment if you did not understand anything. We will surely reach out to you.